All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. So now that we have come to this point in the course, let's do a quick review in terms of what we have read. So we begin this course by starting with a primer of critical race theory. We talked about the founding philosopher of critical race theory. We talked about the central tenets and arguments of critical race theory. We actually broke down the words critical race in theory. And what we pulled out of that are two things. First of all, if it's critical race theory, it necessarily centers and involves a study of law in some capacity, in some way, shape, or form. And that the central tenet of critical race theory is that race and racism is a permanent feature of society as we know it today. That is the Western colonial world. Right? After we move through that primer, we then transition to studying Charles Mills in The Racial Contract. And remember, the argument that Charles Mills is making in his text is that, well, there is this thing called the social contract, but what makes the social contract possible is the racial contract, right? And remember what one of the key arguments that he made there was that although all white persons are not signatories of that contract, they are beneficiaries of it. After we read and studied Charles Mills, we then transitioned to Cheryl Harris, Whiteness is Property, and we learned a number of things there. But one of the main things that we learned is that law, as it is demonstrated in the United States, enshrines whiteness in such a way to where whiteness is recognized as a type of property that has rights, that has benefits, that has entitlements and protections, and that law, what? Jealously guards whiteness, right? And after we move through the study of whiteness as property, we then transition to stand your ground laws. That was the Marcus Lee piece, originating standing your ground. And we studied stand your ground specifically, and we could have studied a number of things, but we studied stand your ground laws specifically to get a better understanding of what? Whiteness is property that is made possible by what? The social contract that is brought into being by what? The racial contract. After that, we turned our attention to what an intervention is and what it means in academic spaces in terms of knowing that an intervention is an important contribution to a field that helps to deepen and expand the field. And accordingly, we looked at an example for that for critical race theory. And we looked at critical race feminism. And to get an understanding of what the field of critical race feminism is doing, we centered the lives and experiences of Black women. And accordingly, we read two pieces. We read the Combahee River Collective Statement, and we also read Kimberly Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Gender. So all of those things taken together now brings us to our final reading, The Meaning and Impact of Racism, where we're going to look at the various articulations of racism so that we understand how this operates. Now, a question that a person could ask is, well, why didn't we start with that? Because typically when you start with a definition of racism, right, there is pushback in terms of, well, that's not what it is, etc. But now that we have studied the field of critical race theory, we understand what critical race theorists are getting at. We understand that a central tenet and argument of the field is that race and racism are permanent features of society within the Western world context that Charles Mills is talking about. Then the question now becomes exactly what is racism? And so now our next reading, The Meaning and Impact of Racism, in this lecture is going to unpack that, and it's going to help critical race theory as a field be that much more clear. Because once we understand what it is, we will then understand why critical race theory says that it is a permanent feature, and we will also understand why knowing it is important, so that way we can identify it. And identifying it isn't for the sake of saying, oh, that's racist, or oh, you're racist. It's the purpose of identifying and calling a thing for what it is so that we can fix the issue. However, let me say this in front of time. Fixing an issue such as race and racism means that you're going to have to be willing to give something up. And toward that end, the arguments of Charles Mills then becomes very clear. Because remember, Charles Mill says, hey, to the extent that the nation state is still in place, then race and racism is still a thing and remains a thing until that thing dissolves. And to the extent that one holds on to whiteness as property and its benefits, to the extent that that remains, then race and racism still are perpetuated. So if we are to repair the bridge of racism and do away with it, that means a group of persons would have to be willing to give up that which has been privileged to them wrongly. That ill-gotten gains, they would have to say, we relinquish those things. With that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the lecture. So what does this reading do, right? The reading starts off by distinguishing the difference between prejudice and racism, right? And the reading makes very clear that prejudice is a negative attitude toward a person or group based on a social comparison in which the individual's own group is taken as the positive point of reference. What is an example of this? So, an example, if I say that, oh, black people are better, right? That means that I am taking my group, my individual group, as a positive point of reference. And that particular type of reference is what? That renders as prejudice. Now let's be clear about this, right? In terms of, well, before I go there, let's get the definition of racism before I go there. Then we'll distinguish some things out, right? Now, on the other hand, what is racism? Racism is the exercise of power. One more time, the exercise of what? Power against a racial group that is defined as, slow down through this part, you see the definition, as inferior by individuals and institutions with the intentional or unintentional support of the entire culture. Now remember, when we started our study process together, that we were very clear that the words and as well as or are important words within law, because and means it requires both, or means one or the other. So there is a series of qualifications. Now that we have studied law and we understand how this moves through society, what then becomes the definition of racism? That it is the exercise of power. We're going to talk about what power is in just a bit. Against a what? First of all, it has to be a racial group, right? A racial group that is defined as what? Number two, inferior. So a racial group that has been defined as inferior by what? Individuals and institutions with the intentional or unintentional support of the entire culture. Y'all picking up what's being put down here? What else is it? That racism is dynamic, that it's not static, and that it may happen in various ways simultaneously. That it doesn't just have to be individual, that one can experience racism individually, institutionally, and structurally all at one time. But let's be clear that racism is the exercise of power against a racial group that has been defined as inferior. If you belong to a racial group that has not been defined as inferior, then you cannot experience racism. Now, on the other hand, you can experience prejudice. Let's be very clear. And that's not to say that prejudice is not harmful. That's not to say that prejudice will not hurt your feelings. That's not to say if there is an altercation between a black person and a white person, and the black person does something to the white person, that it cannot be harmful to their physical bodies. But that is an instance of prejudice and not racism. Why? Because racism, again, is the exercise of power against a racial group that has been defined as inferior by individuals and institutions with the intentional or unintentional support of the entire culture. That is important. Now, let's be very clear about this. Why am I taking my time in distinguishing this out and parsing this out, right? Because sociologically, these definitions mean something, right? All too often, we conflate prejudice and racism, and they are two different things. One has to deal with the exercise of power against a racial group that has been defined as inferior to another group, right? And again, with the intentional or unintentional support of the entire culture, whereas prejudice is a negative attitude toward a person or group based on one's own beliefs, but it does not require the exercise of power because it's just with the person. And again, we're going to talk about power in just a bit. We're going to unpack these terms. But as we are unpacking these terms, now you get a more clear understanding of why CRT says that racism is a permanent feature of society. That now that we're getting into these definitions, that it becomes more clear, right? So with that being stated, what are the various ways in which racism materializes? Let's look at these really quickly, right? And then we're going to break down power and some other things. First of all, there's individual racism, right? And that is when one holds beliefs. Now watch this, because we just parsed out prejudice and racism, right? We just parsed this out. So stick with me here, right? And again, we're defining out what racism is so that we're clear about why CRT says that it is a permanent feature. And some things are start turning over in your head. So what is individual racism? Individual racism is when one holds beliefs of the racial superiority of one group over another, and there's that word there, and is able to engage in practices that reinforce or actualize the inferiorization of that group. In other words, in order for it to be racism, in this instance, when we're talking about individual racism, it means that not only do beliefs have to be present, but you have to be able to engage in a practice that reinforces or actualizes the inferiorization of that group. So the question you have to ask yourself is that, is it possible for black folk in this example to engage in practices that reinforce or actualize the inferiorization of white folk? And are white folk within society considered inferior as a group? Y'all picking up what's being put down here? So accordingly, individual racism is not the same as prejudice. And again, that's not to say that prejudice is not harmful. That's not to say that there hasn't been some altercations that hasn't come about as a result of prejudice. But there is a distinguishing between the two. And the reason why there has to be a distinguishing between the two, because often in society what happens is that folks want to do racist things but not be called racist, right? Meanwhile, folks who engage in prejudice, who sometimes engage in prejudice acts, are identified as racist. Do you see the flip that happens there? It is the inversion. So we're being clear about the definitions here, right? And what are we going to go back to, right? Remember when we hit that lecture about when folks claim reverse racism? Catch it. What that says was again, now that we're looking at the definition of it, what that instinctively says is that person is aware when they make claims of reverse racism, that they are instinctively aware that not only do they themselves believe that their actual racial group is superior, but they are also aware that they have the ability to engage in practices that reinforce or actualize the inferiorization of the person of the group that they are referring to, and hence they are leaning on whiteness as property, because whiteness as property extends the rights, the social privileges to be able to engage in said activities. Do y'all see what's happening here? Right? And then there is institutional racism. And what is institutional racism? Institutional racism is the conscious manipulation of institutions to achieve racist objectives. That's one manifestation of institutional racism. What's another one? The other manifestation of institutional racism is a byproduct or an extension of the practices of institutions that impinge on the rights and access of particular groups. What's an example of this? So the conscious manipulation of institutions to achieve racist objectives would look like a news corporation firing all folks of color, and those predominantly represented on the airwaves are now white folk. The conscious manipulation of institutions to achieve a racist end objective. Do you all see what's happening there? right? What's an example of Part B? Because Part B says a byproduct or an extension of the practices of institutions that impinge on the rights and access of particular groups. The SAT, the ACT. Because what we know, right, as sociologists, is that all children are not prepared in the same way for the SAT, ACT because of the way in which resources are allocated across schools. We know that. So when a college centers and prioritizes test scores, that typically places black students and students of color at a disadvantage because where students are located within the municipality in which they live. But it privileges white students because of what? They have access if they live in the proper community, because here geography comes to be important, right? Because they live in communities that are well-resourced, that are able to prep them for the test. So hence, black and brown admissions not being where they should be or at the numbers that they should be becomes a byproduct of the policies of the college, because the college is not necessarily paying attention to what the SAT, ACT is doing. The college is saying, just look, it's a test. You know, the company makes money from doing that test. We prioritize that test. And you're going to need to take that test to get up in here potentially, right? It becomes a byproduct. Do you see what's happening there? So there's that. That could also be called what? Disparate impact. Remember, we talked about that, right? So let's move on. What's another way in which racism materializes? Structural. There's structural racism, right? And what is structural? Structural racism is the arrangement of laws, social policies, statutes, etc., which guarantee and reinforce racialized social arrangements such that the outcome of such arrangements is predictable. In other words, this was happening down at City Hall. When they're voting on, you know, the police department gets an increase in this budget, but we'll pull away from this budget. We'll take away from education. This also happens on the national level. That when we're talking about structural, we are talking about how institutions are arranged in society, but also the laws and the social policies and statutes of a society that act as the structure. And that according to laws that are passed and social policies and public policies, etc., that when those policies are passed, that the outcome of said policy becomes predictable. What's an example of this? Where police stations are located, the concentration of police stations. So if the concentration of police stations are primarily located in black and brown communities, that means that black and brown people are surveilled at a higher rate than those on the other side of town. That those on the other side of town are experiencing a level of freedom and autonomy, whereas black and brown folks are experiencing what? Unfreedom. And that is guaranteed by way of what? Structural racism. Because that means that someone at City Hall had to make a decision where funds go, where the police station is going to be built. Someone within the police station had to say, okay, well, we're going to put this many police officers in this community and we're going to concentrate it all over here while these people over here can walk around unsurveilled. Do you all see what it's going on here? What does this make clear? That when we talk about the iterations of racism, it's a decision. It's not happenstance. It's a decision. It is a choice. It is opting in. Do you all see what's happening here? Right? This is why CRT says, this thing right here called racism is a permanent feature of Western societies, because it's required to keep the nation state together, because you got to make all these decisions. Why? Because politics, which is inherently racialized, because we understand that politics is the process of who gets what, when, where, how, and why. And to the extent that we understand that that is what politics is, then we understand that the outcome of how resources and goods and life-sustaining resources are distributed becomes racialized according to where highways are built, where police stations are, what's the word that I'm looking for? The quality, there we go, the quality of goods in grocery stores. All of that matters. So you can go to a grocery store on one side of town, and it is radically different than the experience that you will have on another side of town. And it also happens with food deserts, right? Again, structural racism. Right? Moving on to cultural racism, and there are a number of ways in which cultural racism can materialize. So what are those ways? One, that it may be expressed institutionally or individually. What does this look like? The military recently allowed for braids to be allowed, right? California passed the Crown Act, where a black person's hair cannot be a point of being terminated, or they can't be written up for it, right? Institutionally. Right? What's another one? Cultural appropriation. What's an example of this? The Kardashians. Sit with it. Sit with it. Because features that were ascribed to black women and that were considered negative in society, when they are copied and pasted onto other bodies that are not black, then they become in vogue. And next thing you know, folks are on the cover of magazines doing all of these other different things. Cultural appropriation. Right? That's number two. Number three, what's another one? When groups, societies, or individuals allege the racially based superiority of their cultural heritage. Now, y'all know an example of this, because we're seeing this right now in real time. Right? That would be cultural racism. Now you understand why the definition of racism says that it can manifest in various ways at one time. In other words, racism is an individual instances. It happens 24/7, 365, 366 in a leap year, that it is necessary in order for the present colonial project to be a thing, because a certain people has to believe that they are superior in order for this project to continue. Do you all see what Charles Mills, the argument of Charles Mills mapping here? Do you see why CRT is saying that, no, this is a permanent fixture and feature in society? Now that we are breaking down these terms and we are getting clear about what it is and what it is not, right? Next up is environmental racism, right? And what is that? I'm just going to read the first few words of the line here, and I'll let you read the paragraph on your own. So make sure that you take a screenshot here so that you get the full paragraph. But environmental racism, briefly, refers to the institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses, and lacks enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. What's an example of this? In Los Angeles, the Inglewood oil field, right? Which is located in very close proximity to the Baldwin Hills Crenshaw community. Some of you all know what I'm talking about, right? Why? Because that oil field produces benzene, methane, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, and other harmful chemicals and particles as well. What does that do? That drives up the particle matter index. What does that mean? That means something for heart attacks, strokes, cancers, etc. So it makes an already vulnerable community that much more vulnerable. It places the community in what? A precarious state by way of what? Laws that are decided what? In City Hall. So that is an example of what? Structural racism, because they are acting within an institution, making individual decisions that comes to impact environmental racism. Do you all see what this means by all of these things can happen at one time? And that once that decision is made, it happens around the clock. That this is something that takes place without end. So racism in most instances, please hear me on this, racism in most instances, it's not just somebody, calling you a racial epithet or doing some type of action to your face. In most instances, racism is silent, it is not seen, but the impact is always visible. Y'all seeing why CRT makes that central tenet claim now? Right? What's another example of this? The SoFi Stadium, right? Because SoFi Stadium, when it was built, was able to go around an extensive environmental impact review. And they wanted to do that because it would have taken months and cost a whole lot of money to do. And they were able to do that by going through a loophole. and getting the city council of Inglewood to approve it. Now, later on, Governor Gavin Newsom does say, okay, the stadium is environmentally sound. But the point here is that what would have happened if that stadium wasn't environmentally sound? What is furthermore the point is that a black community is allowed to be made subject to an experiment, to an environmental experiment that could have exposed them to more harm. That they could even be made subject to an experiment. Do you all see what's going on? Meanwhile, on the other side of town, in Westwood, a football stadium cannot be built and will not be built in that community. The city council will not allow it. So therefore, UCLA football team plays where? At the Rose Bowl. Do y'all see what's happening here? Because that community can't be made will not allow themselves to be made subject to experimentation. Whereas in Inglewood, the potential of money that could be made and is now being made, right, allowed for a type of experimentation to take place. Therefore, capitalism, as it has always been, becomes what? Racialized. Do you all see what the reason why CRT is making this central tenet? Right? Now, what becomes important here to understand, right, is that, of course, racism doesn't just impact black folk, right? Because it's not just white and black folk on the planet, as Ozawa found out. We talked about his case, Ozawa, right? What else is important to understand? Anti-Blackness. And the reason why understanding anti-Blackness is important is that because even though non-white and non-black persons can experience racism, they can still engage in anti-black behaviors and practices, such as the cases in Ozawa. Remember when he said, well, I'm not black, and so therefore I'm white, and you should allow me to be naturalized. And to say, remember when we went over that case? And the Supreme Court said, well, not so quick. Not so quick now. So what is anti-blackness? It is the use of social power, stigmas, and violence against black people by non-white and non-black persons toward the attaining of social recognition and resources. And it may be intentional or unintentional. We just talked about Ozawa as an example. What's another example? Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard University, because they said that you're admitting too many black students, but we should be taking those seats. Right? We have to unpack this. We have to call a thing for what it is. So if a group understands their power and what they can get in society by way of their proximity to whiteness, by way of negating blackness, then that is what we call anti-blackness. Because they're saying, I am entitled to this because I am not what? That. And so what do? It's the use of social powers and stigmas. What did Ozawa say about black folks in that case? Go back and read it, or go back and get that lecture, right? So that you're clear. So now we have on the table what? Prejudice, racism, and anti-blackness. Now, the purpose in pointing out prejudice, racism, and anti-blackness is not to point fingers and say, this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing. The purpose in delineating between these things is so that we understand the operation of society and that we understand the larger context of what does Charles Mills say in his book, the larger context of white supremacy in which we are operating in. And if we see a thing and we identify it correctly, then we should be able to understand that our struggle is not horizontal, or should not be horizontal against one another, but that the struggle should be what? Vertical. That if we are able to articulate what prejudice is and its harms, and if we are able to articulate what racism is and its harms, and the same thing with anti-blackness along with its harms, then we can say, okay, how do we come together? How do we stop these things? And how do we stop perceiving one another as the enemy of each other? And how do we begin to work horizontally together as opposed to struggling amongst one another over resources that's been divvied down from the top? And how do we move our horizontal efforts vertically? That is the point in delineating these things out. not necessarily to finger point, but to identify social actions by individuals in institutions, in structures, and say, okay, we understand what is happening here socially. So now we need to start moving what? Vertically, as opposed to what? Against one another horizontally. Do you all see the move that is happening here? That is why critical race theory refers to itself as a what? As a movement. Right? It's so that we can see a thing, correct the thing, and move on. But this goes back to what was stated at the top of the lecture, that when we start delineating out what these terms are and what they mean, what that necessarily means is that if we are going to move forward, you're going to have to give some stuff up. That getting folks to come together across difference is not an easy process, because of the larger social constraints in Western world context in which we reside. This is why the first sentence in Charles Mill's book is so very important, because it helps us to understand why we don't see and perceive one another correctly, and why it is that we struggle amongst ourselves instead of sending that power what? Vertical. You all see what's the move that's happening there? So with that being stated, speaking of power, right? Because the definition of racism says that it is the exercise of power. So then that begs the question, what is power? Let's get clear about it. What is power? Right? Power manifests in three ways. We're going back to the reading here. What are those ways? It is physical conquest or domination. Now, before I go further, let's be clear, right? This is why this root definition in getting to the word of power is why we are very clear about why black folks cannot be racist. Can they be prejudiced? Or can we be prejudiced? Yes. And again, that's not to say that prejudice is not harmful, but we're talking about very specific sociological terms that have a very specific meaning. Now, if we know that racism is the exercise of power, what then is power? It is physical conquest or domination. It is the superimposition of ideology. It is the development of institutional infrastructure. Let's take each one of these in turn very quickly. What is physical conquest or domination? The military, police, National Guard, leaving those things in place. Why? Because the military, the police, the National Guard are required, are necessary elements to do what? To hold the nation state together. Because if you do something that's out of line, guess what's going to happen? The police are going to be there to reinforce it. If you go too far out of line, what's going to happen? The military is going to show up to reinforce it. Therefore, the nation state itself is an inherently racialized, violent project that is held together by way of armed men and women in the armed services. The purpose of the armed services is not just to protect from those without. It is also to protect against the nation state caving in on itself. Even though now, the moment we're in right now, we can critique this, right? But you all follow what I'm saying here. Right? What's next up? The superimposition of ideology. What does that look like? Law and order. We've heard this. Right? And Republicans aren't the only side of politics that believe in law and order, because Democrats are there too. Right? It also looks like grade school public education. What does that mean? Stand, recite the Pledge of Allegiance, put your hand over your heart. Everybody walk in a single line. When the bell rings, you're dismissed to go to the next class or dismissed to go to lunch. It is the superimposition of ideology. That a family is a man, a woman, 3 kids, a white picket fence, a dog, and a cat. That is ideology, without giving credence and respectability to the different ways that family can manifest. In a lot of cultures, family is communal, right? So that is another exercise of power. What's another one? The development of institutional infrastructure. What is this? It's social institutions. And what do? They reinforce race in its harms in the arrangement of society. So what are we talking about? We're talking about schools, prisons, jails, courts, hospitals, right? Again, black women are the #1 demographic for maternal mortality. And it is the development of institutional infrastructure that is backed by the superimposition of ideology that comes out of the work of Dr. J. Marion Sims, look him up, that exposes black women to that. And so when we talk about that racism is the exercise of power, In order for it to qualify for racism, all of these things have to be within the group which the individual represents. Physical conquest or domination, the superimposition of ideology, and the development of institutional infrastructure. And again, it is not we're not going through this for the purposes of what? Finger pointing. We're going through this for the purpose so that we understand how society operates. So then the question becomes, if racism is the exercise of power, we understand that power manifests as physical, ideological, and institutional infrastructure. What is the end work of these three areas? Here we go. I've said this before. The end work is necessarily, in this instance, violence. And what do we mean by that? How is violence defined in this instance? Violence is any relation. Here we go. Any relation, process, or condition by which an individual and or group, listen to me carefully, violates the physical, social, education, economic, psychological, and or autonomous integrity of another person and or group. In other words, someone doesn't have to touch you in order for it to be considered what? Violence. It is any relation or process or condition. That is the end work of power within the definition of racism that critical race theory says, right, and argues is a permanent fixture in society. Do you see how we're going deep into the weeds here in terms of understanding the definition and what it is doing, right? I hope this is helpful. So then that brings up the question of if we understand that racism is the exercise of power, that power manifests as physical, ideological, and infrastructure, and that the end work of that is violence, then what is the ultimate arc or end goal of violence? Here we go. We're going back to Charles Mills, week 1. What did he say in that first sentence? And what is the end work? White supremacy. And what is white supremacy, right? And this is one of the things we have to get clear about. That by way of Charles Mills' text, what we understand is that white supremacy is a governing principle. It is an international framework, not just U.S. It is an international framework whereby which we understand the world. It is a societal formation. A societal formation. Catch it. In which white folks are structurally, institutionally, and culturally centered in privilege. In other words, white supremacy is not someone calling you a racial epithet. That is what we as sociologists call what? A racialized act. But white supremacy in and of itself is what? It is a societal formation. Somebody's getting it. It is a societal formation. It is an ideology that is made physical by way of the social construction of law, right? Which also lets us know what? That crime in the monarchy of criminal is also what? Social construction, but that's another class, right? That's criminology 101. We'll come, maybe we can do that another time. But it lets us know, and it helps us to understand that we need to differentiate between a racialized act and what white supremacy is. Because if you're not careful, you just say, okay, well, this person doing that is white supremacy. No, baby, that's a racialized act. We're talking about a societal formation here. Go back to the first sentence in Charles Mills's book. And after you do that, go back to the primer lecture where we visit critical race theory's primary tenet, that racism is permanent in society. Why? Because white supremacy is a societal formation. It is intentional. Oh, God. I hope someone is getting this, right? It is an intentional formation. Therefore, the struggles over resources and politics and different things of that sort, that we keep wrestling on this plane over these things, but we're all wrestling within the societal formation. If we go back to Charles Mills week 1, that's why he said whether it's liberalism, right? What else did he look at? Whether it's a democracy. He looked at all of these different variations and materializations of governmental societies in Western colonialism. He said what? That these are all fall up under the umbrella of what? White supremacy, because it is a what? It is a societal formation. It is a governing principle. It is a framework whereby which we understand the world. That it informs what we see, how we interpret it, even down to how we relate to one another. So the reason why we distinguish and delineate these terms is so that we can get a grip on what is going on. And it's not for the purposes of calling someone out, but it's to call someone in and to call them what? Up. So that we can organize across difference and begin to fight vertically and stop fighting horizontally. I hope this is making sense, right? Lastly, let's end on this so that way we understand how society works more clearly. And this comes from The Boundaries of Blackness by Kathy Cohen, which was published in 1999. By way of distinguishing out these terms, it now helps us to understand intergroup contestations within a white supremacist societal formation more clearly now. Do you all see the work that, oh my goodness, do you all see the work that CRT is doing? That critical race feminism is doing? Do you all see why now there's a pushback against it? Because it helps us to understand society more clearly. Now let's take a look at these intergroup contestations so that we can really understand what's going on up in here and why I keep saying that the struggle should not be horizontal, but it should be vertical. First, let's begin with advanced marginalization. What is it? Kathy Cohen says that it is the allowing of limited mobility. Hear this. Limited mobility of racialized persons to move up in professional settings in society more broadly. In other words, LeBron James is intentional. Oprah Winfrey is intentional because allowing certain folks through from racialized groups, that is the whole point of how the society is structured. Woo! It does not mean that racism and anti-Blackness does not exist, but it is designed so that only a few get through. Let's move deeper into the definition. Advanced marginalization. What else does it say from Kathy Cohen? Moreover, advanced marginalization transfers, here we go, much of the direct social professional management of others, less privileged, marginal group persons to individuals who share the same group identity. What does this look like when Barack Obama showed up at Morehouse College? In 2013 and told them to stop making excuses, that the responsibility of the group was transferred to him. That when the nation needed a president, he showed up as the he showed up as the commander-in-chief. But for some reason, when it came to black issues, he shows up as the father-in-chief. Do you all see what's happening here? Woo! I hope somebody is getting this, right? And it's not just Barack Obama that's this type of person, right? This also happens in Hollywood spaces, right? This also happens in corporate spaces where you send the upper tier black person in management to go talk to the rank and file black folk and say, y'all better hold it together now. Now they done let me up in here. Do y'all see what's going on? My goodness, right? But that is the intergroup contestation. It is designed that way. It is designed this way. You all have to get this. And what some of you are probably picturing in your mind, which is also correct, right? Is the construction of the plantation during enslavement, where there would be some who were overseers who were black that looked over the others who were enslaved, but yet the overseer who was black was still enslaved himself. Who am I necessarily referring to? Stephen from Django? That's an example of advanced marginalization. Let's look at cross-cutting political issues and how this begins to play out intergroup. And when we say intergroup, we're talking about within the black community, within the Latino community, within white communities as well, right? These things still apply, right? Because again, as Toni Morrison said, that racism has just as much of an impact on white folk as it does black folk. Think about that, right? But cross-cutting political issues, what is it? Cross-cutting political issues are concerns which disproportionately and directly affect only certain segments of a marginal group, i.e. black women. Right? These issues stand in contrast to consensus issues which are understood to constrain or oppress with equal probability, although manifesting differently, all identifiable marginal group members. What is an example of that? We looked at that. This is why critical race feminism is important, because the issues that are important to black women typically do not map as issues that are important to black folk as a group. So therefore, the issues of black women become what? A cross-cutting issue. In her text, in Boundaries of Blackness, Kathy Cohen examines the HIV/AIDS pandemic that took place, right? When that breakout was happening. And that became a cross-cutting issue. Why? Because of the way that black churches were acting. Y'all see what's happening here? Because those issues aren't seen what? To represent the group. Why? Because what the group is trying to do is fit into the larger social setting of what? White supremacy. Because it is what? It is a societal formation. And there's a contestation about, well, we need to do this in order to get access to this because this is what the structure requires. And nobody is critiquing the structure. But everybody's trying to participate in the... Right? This is the strength and power of CRT. Let's move on. Secondary marginalization. What is it? Secondary marginalization is when non-dominant persons in charge, in this case, example, we can think about black people, replicate a rhetoric of blame and punishment, directing it at the most vulnerable and stigmatized in their community. What does this look like? Now, I'm black, so I'm just going to use a black example, right? When black folks are walking around, they'd be like, oh my gosh, they're so loud and this is so embarrassing. Hello? That's secondary marginalization. When there are non-dominant persons in charge that begin to replicate blame and say, you need to act right. You're embarrassing us. You need to know how to code switch. That's called what? Secondary marginalization. In all of these different articulations, advanced marginalization, cross-cutting political issues, and secondary marginalization, all of these are taking place within the context of what? Prejudice, racism, and anti-Blackness, which all plays out under the larger societal arrangement of what? White supremacy. Do you all now see why studying critical race theory is important? Because it unveils all of this. It highlights all of this. And again, what I want to reiterate is that delineating between prejudice, racism, and anti-Blackness is not to necessarily call one out, but it's so that we understand. Now, I'm not saying that you don't call a thing a thing. That's not what I'm saying. But the purpose in identifying is to say, let's fix this. That's why CRT is called what? A movement. And with that being said, that is our journey together in the text. We'll have one more lecture for this series, and then that will conclude our studying time together. So I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one. Peace.